on and on and on. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. That is a tremendously long period of time that is quite different than, say, what many of us experienced in the 2018, Anchorage earthquake. The other thing that's different, requires us to think differently, is movements that can be 20 meters or more during the earthquake. So whereas we might think of earthquakes as, a vibration, sort of someone grabbing you by the shoulders and shaking, these really large earthquakes are more like, lurching on ocean waves or something, just massive displacements. And the third thing to keep in mind is that when we experience large earthquakes, the vast majority of the time, sorry, not the vast majority of the time, on occasion, that also initiates sort of the countdown, if you will, to a tsunami or a tsunami threat. And I want to dwell on that for just a moment, because nationally we tend to separate earthquakes and tsunamis into two different hazards. We study them differently, we advocate for them differently, we educate people differently. But for coastal Alaska, they're part of the same bad day. In fact, they interact with one another. We have to think about, when we teach people about tsunami evacuation, we need to make clear that actually you might be duck covering and holding for the first 5 minutes of that. Or do you duck cover and hold if you're down on the beach or, very close to the coast in some of our communities? These are part of the same sequence of events. And we look at these a lot in terms of, colored maps, and we know in our various communities where the hazards are likely, the tsunami hazards likely are. But I just need to refresh us, keep at the front of our minds what these look like. We don't have cell phone video from 1964. It's been a very long time since we had an earthquake that triggered a damaging tsunami in Alaska, but the 2011 Tohoku earthquake offers some good parallels. And I just want to watch 20 seconds of this just to remind ourselves that a tsunami is not a bunch of water sort of flowing through town. This is a slurry, a thick slurry of mud, trees, cars, anything it's picked up in the way that just bulldozes anything in its path. And I don't think this video is a bad representation of what Kodiak probably looked like in 1964, or Valdez, or Seward, or many other places. I think this is a reasonable, analogy, if you will. All right, lastly, ways that we lag other parts of the United States. Look, all of our infrastructure, our major infrastructure projects, our public buildings are built with an attempt to account for seismic hazard. But that effort is only as good as our understanding of what the hazards actually are. All of our public buildings are built in adherence with the building codes. But again, the building code itself is premised on an understanding of what the geologically plausible and expected earthquake scenarios are. And that is an area in which we remain weak. Our code is only as strong as what we understand. And let me give you a quick example here. These are two images to scale. They're the same size of the Western US and Northern Alaska, looking at what is currently the national US seismic hazard map. And I want to point out the resolution in the Western US image on the left, and fine scale features that would allow one to distinguish the seismic hazard, sometimes on the scale of 10 kilometers or so. And if we look at parts of Alaska, I've got Northern Alaska here, that is diffused or blurred over hundreds of kilometers to the point where I'm not sure it's really that meaningful. When we tackle major infrastructure projects, people hire teams of engineers to figure this out instead. And I'm going to make a point that I think we are economically disadvantaged by our poor knowledge of earthquakes. And what I mean by that is having to invest not only in some of the foundational science to know whether or not or how to build a major project, but also having to, in some cases, overbuild our facilities to account for the uncertainty in what to expect in the way of earthquakes. All right, the last point I would make, the last way in which we lag other parts of the country is that there is no earthquake early warning rollout underway in Alaska. That is not on the horizon at the moment. California, Oregon, Washington have all worked for many years now to begin a nascent public version of earthquake early warning. And that is simply not in the cards in the immediate future in Alaska. And I'm going to similarly argue that long term, I think this is, again, a question of economically disadvantaging the state. This is not an issue today, but I do expect in the not too distant future, earthquake early warning will be a societal expectation. And that when thinking about, well, should we do this in Alaska, or, this over here or not, I'm going to guess that actually becomes part of the conversation. Well, Alaska has no early warning. That increases the risks to us in various ways. That's not an issue right now, but I'm going to posit to this crowd that it becomes one in the years to come. So with that, I'll wrap up and move on to our next speaker, but just to re-hit these 3 points that I hope you will carry with you going forward into this discussion. Thanks.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Sterling Strait, and I believe I am our next speaker. And we're going to go through the usual thing here. Am I on mute? Can you see my screen? Am I speaking into the void?
I hear you. I do not see your screen yet.
Less excellent. Well, let's try this again.
I see full page slides.
Thank you very much, sir. All right. It's a joy in our day of Zoom, I tell you. And I can't wait to hear to no longer have to ask the question of, am I on mute every other day? So someday we'll be moving on. In the meantime, I'm here to talk about seismic resiliency for Alaska. Again, my name is Sterling Strait, and I am a member of the Alaska Seismic Hazard Safety Commission, where we think about these things and think about how we can implement policies and what we can do to improve resiliency of Alaska, safety of Alaska, tsunami, earthquake, all of the above. And resilience has been a kind of a hot topic lately for the last few years in the building industry. And the question often is really, what does resilience mean? And when we talk about resilience, what we really want is how prepared are we for a rapid return to normal? From the time the ground stops shaking, how long is it going to take for life to return to some semblance of normal, for kids to be back in schools, for the grocery stores to be open, for us to be back at our day jobs? And that's really one of our main goals for a lot of our policies is if we can achieve that goal, we're achieving seismic safety, we're achieving good buildings, we're achieving so much that we desire, and we're prepared to survive and thrive even in our earthquake-rich environment here. So what does that really look like in a true case? Well, we've got a great, almost textbook example in our recent history here. As Mike mentioned, we had the 2018 Anchorage earthquake. This happened in November 30th, 2018. It was magnitude 7.1, and it was located about 9 miles from downtown Anchorage. And if you happen to be in Anchorage at the time, you might have noticed it. It had some decent shaking. And what did that look like for Alaska? Well, our infrastructure got beat up a bit. Our roads, our ports, our airports, railroad, all of the above suffered damage. And all of the above were back up and running within, in some cases, hours, days, at the worst, weeks. And in many cases, we were a banner case for just road construction for the rest of the country. The fact that we had, in this specific case here, this road was damaged on a Friday, and Tuesday we had it repaved, fixed, and even lines painted. I mean, that in the construction industry, that's amazing in itself. But following an earthquake, it's remarkable. Our schools performed well. Uh, in that earthquake, it mostly impacted Anchorage and the Matsu Valley, and almost all schools in that area were reopened within 10 days. Uh, Many of those facilities had been retrofitted over the years, and that performed well. And this is a very key point, and more so than just the immediate impact of the safety of the schools. As we've seen in the last year with other events, there's a huge impact of kids not being able to go back to schools. If all the kids in a community are suddenly stuck at home with nothing to do, we did see that following the earthquake, that alone had a significant impact in the ability of people to return to school and return to normal. So the fact that we were able to reopen schools so quickly was a huge, huge help in getting our community back up and running. Another thing we saw was evidence that building codes work. As Mike mentioned, there are improvements to be made in the building code, but if you design and construct a building in adherence to the building code, you are you're set up very well for earthquakes. Your buildings will survive well, your people will be safe, and you'll be on the road to recovery much quicker than otherwise. And it's a very stark example of how well this worked. This is a table that was put together by Alaska Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, where they went back and looked at earthquakes in other parts of the world of a similar size to our Anchorage earthquake, and the impact purely in deaths and fatalities from those events. Now, this is ERI. We can get very much into the pedantry of how deep the earthquake was, what the ground motions were, but that 0 deaths just speaks louder than any details we can get into. The fact that we went through this event and did not have any fatalities is remarkable, truly remarkable. And that's down to many things, and building codes is one of the things that really helped us achieve that. Now, over time, as we have had some distance to the earthquake and look back, another picture has started to occur. One that's a little less flattering, and that's in this earthquake, we really got lucky in many different ways. If the ground motion had been a little bit higher, or if it had lasted a little longer, the amount of damage that we would have seen would have been significantly greater. Personally, in my own experience doing inspections following the earthquake, I saw many things that were almost damaged, that had started to fail, but had not completely failed. There was some of the landslide areas in Anchorage that exhibited cracking that could have failed, and we could have seen similar to the 1964 earthquake style landslides if the shaking had lasted longer. So in light of retrospect, we see that there's many ways that we can improve that we didn't do so great following the 2018 earthquake. And going back through the areas we talked about, infrastructure, as we looked at our infrastructure, more and more damage came apparent over time. Here we are 3 years later, and there are still projects ongoing to repair infrastructure. In general, Alaska infrastructure is aging, and we have very limited redundancy. For example, the port, it was a very big deal when they were able to declare the port safe for operation. If that port had been shut down by the 2018 earthquake, we would have been seeing statewide fuel limitations within days and food shortages within weeks. We are very much an island up here, and all of our materials, fuel, food, come from the lower 48 and almost entirely through ships, at least for South Central and even the interior. Anchorage, being the biggest city in Alaska, only is accessible by 2 roads, and both those roads were impacted by this event and closed at various times. If those had been more impacted and had been closed for a longer duration, we would have been very limited in our ability to respond and support other communities and get support from other communities. Thinking about schools, there were 3 schools, 2 in Anchorage, 1 out in the Matsu Valley, that were closed completely by this event, and in all cases remain closed. Some of them are never going to reopen. They are being torn down and rebuilt. And even in the schools that were rapidly reopened, there was significant non-structural damage. These are the things you don't think about in an earthquake. You think more about the building collapse, but what about the ceiling tiles falling down? What about the books falling off the shelves? What about your sprinkler piping? Many of our schools had sprinkler piping breaking, which flooded large portions of the schools and caused significantly more financial damage than the small amounts of structural damage they had suffered. In general, most of our schools in Alaska predate modern seismic building codes, so they have inherent flaws that need to be addressed to improve their safety. And then looking back at building codes, as we looked into how our built infrastructure performed, it became very clear that we are inconsistent in Alaska and how the building code is applied. Depending on where you live, if you buy a house in Alaska, it may or may not be constructed to the latest building code seismic standards. It may or may not have been inspected during construction to verify that it was built properly. It is left up to the local jurisdictions to decide what is applied where, and that results in a vast difference in building. I won't go as far as saying building quality, but the engineering that goes into the building, it's not always there in some communities. And we saw that in a large amount of damage, not necessarily full collapses in most cases, but a large amount of small damage to residences, houses and residents throughout Anchorage, throughout Matsu, Eagle River, Chugiak. And it seemed to fall disproportionately on the areas that had a lower standard of building code adoption and enforcement. So what can we do? How can we improve this? As a member of the Alaska Seismic Hazard Safety Commission, that is our goal, is to study these sort of things and figure out what we can do to do better and make recommendations. So looking back through our discussion points for infrastructure, we can't do much about the fact that there's only a few roads and a few ways in and out of the state, but we can really focus on improving those and make sure that they are survivable, that they will survive an earthquake. Strongly support retrofitting existing infrastructure. The Port of Alaska is going through, even now, repair efforts to both correct and improve its structure so it can support activities and survive the next earthquake. Grant programs is another area we could look at. Many of the, in fact, all of the other West Coast states in the US, they all have high seismic areas, Oregon, Washington, California, and they all have various grant programs supporting both public and private individuals going out and getting grant funding to check their facilities, to do engineering evaluations, and to design and retrofit them to be more resilient under the next earthquake. Following on that theme, schools really need to be inspected. The ones that do have seismic weaknesses, we need to retrofit. We strongly support, and as a commission, we have in the past put in pilot projects to do what's called rapid visual screening. This is where we assist school districts going through all their facilities, rapidly looking at a large number of buildings and identifying the ones that have the highest seismic weaknesses and enabling them to prioritize where they need to focus their efforts to support their retrofit programs. And again, it's the safety of our kids, and even more, and beyond that, it is the ability of us as a community to get back to work without having our kids all at home during the day. And then for building codes, this is a tough one for Alaska. As a commission, we strongly support expanding building code adoption, as well as inspections to enforce the code to make sure things are built correctly. But knowing that Alaska is not a typical place, again, following on one of Mike's themes, Alaska is different than most of the other country. What construction, what design and engineering looks like in the city of Anchorage is very different than what it looks like in communities like Tyonek or other small, very small communities that are outside of the road system in Alaska. It's very difficult and very expensive to build there, and would be very difficult to get inspectors out there. That would be an added cost. So we recommend, and we have talked with the state fire marshal and local building code officials on ways that we can improve it and finding those, focusing on the areas we can fix. So those are my points for today. Critical infrastructure needs to be prepared. We need to be better survivable with our roads, airports, ports, railroads, etc. We want to make sure our schools are safe and that they're able to function both during and after earthquakes. And then our built environment is going to be improved by the adoption and enforcement of building codes. And all that is really in mind that, yes, we did perform reasonably well. In fact, I would say overall very well in the 2018 Anchorage earthquake. But that is not the design earthquake for Anchorage. earthquakes are expected and have occurred that are significantly larger and longer than what we saw in 2018. And we know what happened before, it will happen again. So this is our time to be prepared and to get ready for the next one. And with that, I will pass it off to the next presenter.
So much, Sterling. I'm going to take it over and see if I can get my slides to cooperate. Do you see that?
I can see it. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks everybody again for joining us today. My name is Zara Sayed, and I am very lucky to be here zooming in from California. Thank you for having me in the chapter meeting. I am the chair of the EERI Public Policy and Advocacy Committee with Chris Poland. And I wanted to talk a little bit today about what public policy is, where seismic safety fits in public policy, and what the EERI chapters and public policy committee members have been up to over the last couple of years to try to promote seismic safety advocacy. So I have a couple of definitions of public policy. One that I like is anything a government chooses to do or not to do by Thomas Dye. Another isn't necessarily a definition, but Hedge and Lester did a survey of all definitions of public policy and came up with a couple themes, which says that that public policy is a process or a series of patterns of government activities or decisions that are designed to remedy some public problems, either real or imagined. The real or imagined part is interesting because you can be solving for a problem that exists, or you might be solving for a problem that doesn't exist. And EERI's involvement in public policy is through its mission statement, which is to reduce earthquake risk, in part by advocating for comprehensive and realistic measures for reducing the harmful effects of earthquakes. And so when we talk about public policy, it's an ongoing process. It doesn't have a clear beginning or end. And when we're engaging with legislators or working on legislative language or outcomes, we're often asking, who does a policy benefit and who is burdened by the policy? It's all about compromise and financial underpinnings of justifying your position. So I'm going to walk through a couple of different pieces of legislation at the federal and state level and start off with this one, which is the 1977 Earthquake Hazard Reduction Act, which is motivated by the 1964 Alaska earthquake and the 1971 San Fernando earthquake. And through the Earthquake Hazards Reduction Act was created the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program, or NEHRP, which was the first national earthquake research program and involved 4 federal agencies to essentially come up with policies and programs and coordinate on earthquake risk awareness and reduction. And you see those agencies listed here. And their goals include developing effective practices and policies, improving techniques for reducing earthquake vulnerabilities, hazard identification, and understanding of earthquakes and their effects. Anybody who's tried to understand return periods can understand the complications of how that translates to just an ordinary person. And what's really great is that many of our EERI members are directly involved in impact NEHRP. We have the Advisory Committee on Earthquake Hazard Reduction, ACER, and this is the direct and public voice of the executive branch about the NEHRP program. It assesses the trends and developments of NEHRP and its effectiveness, its needs for revisions, and kind of strategic planning as well. And so this is a 2019 snapshot of the ACER members. We have a new set of members now. We don't have a picture of them, but many of the members are EERI, they're members, they're past EERI presidents or have been on the board, which is really wonderful for us because we get to get a kind of an inside understanding of what these conversations are like. And all of their meetings are also public record, and I encourage you to take a look at what they talk about at these meetings. In 2018, NEHRP was up for reauthorization, so we were looking for refunding this really important program. Since 2009, it was going to go up for reauthorization, and we're lobbying really hard to make sure that we had financing for this program that benefits the nation at large, and 50% of the population susceptible to earthquake risk here in the United States. One of the co-sponsors was an Alaska representative, Senator Murkowski, and I believe we did also get in touch with her office at one point. But my co-chair, Chris Poland, actually worked very closely with Senator Feinstein's office as well, and we were able to, put some language in the bill. And so when it came up, actually, we were able to define resilience in a little bit more, a precise way, or maybe more timely with the current way it's defined, and also put in their lifeline infrastructure and some other key components. And thankfully, it was reauthorized in end of 2018, not just because of us, but because of a collective effort. But it was really wonderful to get that win, because we understand the impacts of this important piece of legislation. And through NEHRP, we've been working on this understanding and research of functional recovery, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But a NIST and FEMA report came out in 2021, and many of our ERI members were involved in writing the report and also leading up to the writing of the report. So talking about current state legislation that our members are involved in Oregon, there was this really intense effort to save and fund DOGAMI, which is the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. It's their agency that helps provide sort of hazard maps and preparedness information and guides. And it was unfortunately getting huge budget cuts, which was going to basically gut the organization. Well, they lobbied really hard, and they were able to save DOGAMI, but there's still 5 positions, scientific positions, that they didn't get budget for. So they continue lobbying for a earthquake resilient scientist positions. There are 2 of them, and that's ongoing. But the fact that it was able to stay was a huge win, because this was the only agency doing the kind of work that it was doing in Oregon. In California, where I reside, we've been working since 2018 on some incarnation of AB 1329, which is on functional recovery standards, which is talking about buildings post-event performance and its recovery of its functions in an appropriate amount of time following the earthquake or hazard event. And so we've been it's going to appropriations, and we've been working really hard to speak with stakeholders and opposition, and hopefully it'll go through, and we'll see how the appropriations committees hear this out. In Utah, after the Magna earthquake, there were 2 bills on emergency preparedness amendments and disclosure of unreinforced masonry buildings. And unfortunately, both of them died. But the good news is that the relationship with the scientific community and ERI members with the representative that introduced it lives on and was bolstered. And so this representative will likely reintroduce some version of these bills in the next cycle. So the way that we do member advocacy is through our members in our regions and our nations as well. And we are building our seismic safety capacity, our policy advocacy capacity, through our existing organizational programs and through our chapter and region goals, which is part of the reason that we are holding this webinar. And we also work with like-minded organizations. So we work with the Structural Engineers Association, sometimes other scientific organizations. Sometimes we're a bit more formal with memorandums of understanding or working groups, and in a collective nature, we're advocating for various legislation or areas of concern for us. So in order to really get our members to be confident in how they take their first steps through to a seismic safety advocacy, we developed a Citizen Advocate Toolkit. And you can find this on our ERI website. When you go to the public policy tab, you can scroll down, click Citizen Advocate Toolkit. You'll get this page here, which includes the toolkit and a set of state fact sheets. And so the toolkit will have a quick start guide, a really simple and easy to access your information, to access your legislator, a couple pages on how you speak with your representative, and the state-based fact sheets, which we have one for Alaska here, in which we have information on the state legislature, key dates, key committees, and some major fault information, significant seismic history, any drills and scenarios, and other resources. Now, we worked on this as 2 Californians, so I am asking for your help in updating this. Anybody that's interested to take a look, and please make sure, and I apologize in advance if we got something horribly wrong, but we were trying to do our best to be comprehensive. In it, we will also have information on how to find your legislators, And I'll link in the web link right after my talk here. And then also speaking with your representatives. This one we spent quite a bit of time on, just learning how you pitch your message, right? And how long you should take and how much science you should use in it. And remember that your audience might be like a 25-year-old staff member. So have to remember who you're speaking with to get your point across, and that they rely on you also as the expert. Your goal is to become a sort of a reliable contact for them. And when we do have when we do meet with our representatives, in order to make it sort of easier for us to have a position that's sort of solidly based in facts and consensus, the committee has come up with various policy position statements. I know other science organizations do this as well, but this is essentially talking about what EERI is saying when it's saying schools should be unreinforced masonry free by 2033. We have a one-page policy statement and a longer white paper with every one of these policy statements. And what I encourage people to do is to look at one of these statements, mark it up, make it relevant to your area. If you have some information on the number of URM buildings in Anchorage or Juneau or whatever, you can put it in there, and actually leave this behind or email it to your representative and let them know what concerns you, because they represent you and they should understand that, that this is a huge problem, and we have ways and we have actions by which we can reduce our risk. On the ER website, we also have a current legislation portal called the Legislative Action Center, where we list various bills, current and archived, along with where we are with the bill, our status and position. And if the board has written a letter of support or opposition, we'll also link it in here. I think it's kind of interesting to go through this and see what we've been working on in the last couple of years. And my hope is that we're going to have an Alaska subsection in here fairly soon. So I'm all power to you all here on this call. And I just have a last two slides here, which is talking about how one can engage with the representatives. Sometimes it can be really uncomfortable to take that first step, but it's never too early, too soon, or too late to reach out to your representatives. You can call or email or visit their office remotely. Keep in touch with the staff so you can sometimes find out which key staff is working on environmental or safety type bills, and begin making a relationship with them. Attend virtual town hall meetings. I'm always showing up. This is Rep. Khanna, he's my federal representative and our congressional representative, and I'm always talking. I'm the only one talking about earthquakes, and likely you will be too. So don't stop talking about it, because otherwise they'll never hear it. Have one-on-one meetings in district when COVID is lifted, and also thank them, support other initiatives and thank them. They actually really do appreciate it. And take a look at what else they might be working on at the federal or state level, and build a relationship. That's what we're trying to do. Lessons and best practices for seismic safety, public policy, and advocacy of any kind is to meet people where they are. So learn to navigate and convey unfamiliar information to motivate action. These policymakers are not, they're not geophysicists or seismologists or structural engineers, but they do understand the process and kind of need to know some very particular information to be able to progress seismic safety or tsunami safety or awareness. So meet them where they are and become a trusted advisor. Even saying something like, I don't know about something, but I'll get back to you, actually makes them feel more confident in where you're coming from, and helps build the rapport that you need to, hopefully influence them to propose some bill language in the next session. Try as best as possible to understand what other technical societies are talking about, and try to speak with a unified technical voice. We got in trouble with functional recovery a couple years ago because the legislator got confused because we were saying something and another organization was saying something slightly different. So we created a memorandum of understanding, frequent check-ins, to make sure that even if we have differences, that they're kind of explicitly laid out, and that we can sort of respect and understand where those differences might arise from. And remember that policy priorities are relative. So learn to step in the shoes of the legislator and what other many bills that they're working on, from health to COVID to all other things, and try to sort of be firm in your position on why seismic safety is important, but also realize that likely we don't always get what we want, and it's a very slow process, but no action is too small to start your advocacy journey. And so the last thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, we are, the Biden administration has put out their budget, and they have this $2 trillion infrastructure package. So part of it is, you know, Sterling was talking about infrastructure and the state of infrastructure. And, you know, this is our opportunity to really bring in to say, you know, we hope the budget actually gets appropriated properly. We're going to be reaching out to the Senate and House appropriation committees to send out some letters. And, you know, I encourage every member to do this, but that, you know, this needs to happen. Our schools need to be upgraded, and we need to have you know, at the state level, we need to have more granular understanding of our hazards so we can design in a fashion that's, you know, economically feasible and beneficial. And so with that, I encourage any of you to please reach out to me at policy@eeri.org and consider sitting in or joining one of our meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Zara. So I am going to close it off here. Make sure I present the right screen. Okay. Can everybody see my screen and hear me? Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody, for the great information. So I'm going to just tell you a little about what our chapter has been up to, where we're headed, and what you can do to get involved. So towards the end of last year, we formed a seismic safety advocacy working group within our chapter. After discussing the various causes that we felt needed improvement following the 2018 earthquake, we landed on 2 focus areas to pursue over the next year that also align with EERI's policy positions: improving the reliability of lifeline infrastructure systems and mitigating non-structural hazards in schools. So infrastructure systems are the physical and organizational structures and facilities necessary for the operation of a society. Lifeline infrastructures include water, wastewater, communication, transportation, etc. And as most of you are probably well aware, the majority of lifeline infrastructures are interdependent and co-located, so the performance or failure of one can affect the others in the same corridor. Alaska systems are aging, and there's not much in the way of redundancy, as Sterling mentioned. I remember being trapped in Girdwood after a car crash on the Seward Highway with my mom, and my mom's from Florida, and she turns to me and looks like slightly bewildered, like I'm a moron, like, let's just take a different highway home. And it's like, sorry, Mom, this is Alaska. We don't have another highway home. So like Sterling discussed, we got really, really lucky in the 2018 earthquake, but the next time around, we might not be as lucky in terms of our lifeline infrastructures. So before this happens, we need to assess the resiliency of our infrastructure systems, and at the very least, ensure our system can restore basic services when needed, even in a damaged state. So our working group has been reaching out to utility groups to gauge the seismic resiliency of their systems. Thus far, we've received a mixed reaction, and in some cases, we found that seismic risk is not even considered when developing recommendations. So there's definitely a lot of room for improvement in our lifeline infrastructure, and I'll talk about that a little more in the future, or in the next slide. So our other focus area is the mitigation of non-structural hazards in schools. So non-structural items include ceiling tiles and materials, light fixtures, bookshelves, file cabinets, computer monitors, vending machines, etc. So let's see, sorry. So schools are not evaluated for their non-structural components, yet these are what caused the majority of damage and injuries in the 2018 earthquake. EERI's earthquake reconnaissance report for the 2018 earthquake indicated that structural damage during the earthquake shaking below 60%, even below 60% of the design-based earthquake may not be life safe. Non-structural mitigation for many items can be relatively inexpensive, easy fixes that can often be completed by facility staff or volunteers. They just need to have the right toolkit that allows them to identify, evaluate, and secure non-structural hazards. Our working group has been making contact with school representatives to establish working relationships and evaluate where they're at in terms of identifying and mitigating non-structural hazards. So looking ahead, our working group is planning to reach out to EERI's 2021 Distinguished Lecturer Craig Davis to provide his lecture on operationalizing lifeline infrastructure resilience to earthquakes to our community, state officials, utility companies, et cetera, to get everyone on the same page with where we're at in terms of infrastructure resiliency. We will also be working with school administrators to promote training for school staff on how to reduce earthquake hazards in schools. For example, the ATC developed a 3-hour training session that'll be rolled out this spring that helps school staff and others identify and mitigate non-structural hazards in their classrooms and schools. Through all this, we'll be working with FEMA's Alaska Earthquake Problem Solving Team, which was started earlier this year by Amanda Syock, to gain additional support for these causes. Our ultimate goal for the next year is to develop an actionable plan for each cause that we can pitch to our policymakers and then support and advocate for them to implement our solutions. So what can you do? If you'd like to get involved, you can join our Seismic Safety Advocacy Working Group. You can also pitch us your ideas by emailing them to the email addresses listed here. Or you can take what you've learned in this webinar and reach out to your representatives to support these or other causes that you feel passionately about. So thanks so much for joining us today. And at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions or comments.
Hello, this is Bruce Mason. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead.
You know, I was surprised for your 2018 earthquake in Anchorage, how little damage there was in the city. It's my understanding that the source depth was quite deep. Is that going to be a characteristic of future earthquakes that affect Anchorage? That is, the source distance is deep such that much of the shaking, at least the peak ground acceleration, is actually diminished by the time it hits the surface. Could you comment on that, please?
I can take that one. Thanks for the question. This is Mike West. You're right. That earthquake was about 50 kilometers deep, which means that the near fault shaking, the highest peak ground accelerations, were not experienced on the surface. And that's definitely an important factor in this earthquake. You asked whether that is sort of typical and should be expected. And I think the answer to that is no. That certainly happens sometimes, and a lot of the earthquakes occurring in the subduction zone are like that. But I would point out features like the Castle Mountain Fault just north of Anchorage, which are capable of producing comparable earthquakes, but with surface rupture. So I think we would have a very, very different strong motion landscape in an event like that, with much higher near fault ground motions.
Thank you.
So Zarai, do you want me to go now?
Yeah, go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, this is Colin Maynard. I'm a structural engineer in Anchorage, and I've been involved with the Alaska Professional Design Council's Legislative Liaison Committee since about 1990, and I'm the current chair again. Over the years, APDC, for those of you not from Alaska, the Alaska Professional Design Council is an organization of organizations, American Institute of Architects, Alaska Society of Professional Engineers, Structural Engineers Association of Alaska, land surveyors, landscape architects, interior designers, and several other engineering societies. And we work together to provide a unified voice for the design community in Alaska, and hire lobbyists and go down to Juneau every year and harass the legislators and try to work with them on issues that are important to the design community. Related to seismic safety, we have worked on at least 2, if not 3, code consolidation task force, trying to get all the codes into one department so you can have an actual review of drawings by both mechanical, electrical, as well as the fire safety that is being done now. Right now, we have some codes in the public safety department, the fire marshal's office, and some of them are Department of Labor. Fire marshal reviews for fire safety, but not for structural. Department of Labor does not review drawings at all. They go and inspect when they get around to it. So outside the, I believe there are 12 jurisdictions that have a deferred jurisdiction from the fire marshal. There's little to no inspection and very rudimentary review of structural items anyway. They kind of look at what the loads are, see if they think that that's correct. That has gone nowhere, mostly because of bureaucratic intransigence, but also because there are a lot of places in the state that just don't want building codes because they think it's going to be more expensive. We've also been working with Michael over the last year to make sure that the seismic system that is out there gets funding, so it stays out there, so we get the information that we need, working with Murkowski's office and then with the state legislature. And we've been hammering on the governor's office and the legislators, trying to figure out why the 2018 building code amendments have been stuck in the governor's office since last February when the fire marshal sent them over. For those of you not in Alaska, we're still in the 2012 code, which took 5 years to adopt. It didn't get adopted until 2017, so they skipped to 2015 and started reviewing 2018. And we're about to get to 2021, and we still don't have that adopted. Anyway, so the Alaska Professional Design Council would love to help DERI with the seismic safety advocacy. Actually, one of our talking points with the legislators over the last month has been that we endorse the recommendations of this Alaska Seismic Hazard Safety Commission in building codes and looking at schools and that kind of stuff. So we're already doing that kind of work, partially because the Structural Engineers Association of Alaska is one of our members, but because we all realize that Alaska is the most seismically active state, and you know it's an important public policy issue.
Great. Yeah, that'd be great to work with you. I'll reach out. Yeah, we don't want to duplicate any efforts for sure. So great to work together.
And we have a paid lobbyist who can help you. All you have to do is join APDC.
There you go.
Any other questions?
Yeah, this is Bruce Mason. I have another question if there's time. It's my understanding that outside of the Anchorage Bowl area up there, there is no building codes. So people build pretty much however they wish. And is this, did you sense this is just a cultural difference? Well, what I mean is Alaska, because of the free spirit and the independent minds that might be living there, are different than what we might find in the lower 48, that they perhaps just plain don't like government, that type of thing. Could any of you comment on that? In other words, why there is no building code for areas, let's say outside of the Anchorage area? And why is that? And is that a cultural aspect? I would like to just hear your opinion on that. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Sterling Strait. I'll take this one. I think you hit on a lot of it. Alaska is a very free feeling state in many areas. Historically, it took us a while to adopt building codes, and as Mr. Maynard just mentioned, from the state level, there is no adoption of, for example, the International Residential Building Code. And then once you get down to the individual jurisdictions, some places like the municipality of Anchorage will adopt the building code, the residential code, do reviews prior to construction, do inspections during construction. Once you cross the magic line and you're outside the municipality of Anchorage, it can be, especially thinking about residential, there is no oversight of any sort. And I am going to pass this on to Colin, if you will, because I know Mr. Maynard has studied this and has written pieces about this in the past. So Colin, would you expand on from your knowledge, please.
Yeah, there is a state building code. The Department of Public Safety, Fire Marshal's Office adopts the International Building Code, International Mechanical Code, Fuel and Gas Code, and I think there's one other, the Fire Code, and that applies to the entire state for fourplexes and above. However, there's no enforcement of it. So there's no inspectors going to make sure that this is being built that way. There are 12 jurisdictions that are deferred from fire marshal review: Anchorage, Fairbanks, Juneau, Ketchikan, and 8 more. And they have building departments that do various levels of plan review and inspection. Probably Anchorage is the most intense of the group, but Juneau and Fairbanks are certainly up there with both the review and inspection. Some of the smaller communities do more review or have third parties doing review, and then we'll do inspection. But you're right, if you're out in one of the smaller communities off the road system, or even on the road system, if you're outside one of those 12 jurisdictions, you will have a fire marshal review for fire safety, but there will be no structural review, and there will be no inspector coming to make sure that it was built correctly. And that even applies inside the city of the municipality of Anchorage, but outside the building service area. So Eagle River and Chugiak, Girdwood, you can have that same kind of problem. Even the Mat-Su Valley outside of Palmer and Wasilla, or the Meadow Lakes area, you can have that problem as well. And the reason that, there are a lot of people who don't want building codes. Eagle River has had it on the ballot several times to add that service, and they've turned it down every time. They don't want people to tell them how to build stuff. Oh, and for residential, you basically, your building official is the mortgage companies, banks, and the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation.
Thank you, Colin. Well, that puts us at the 1 hour mark. If you'd like to stay on and continue talking, feel free. Otherwise, thank you all for participating today and tuning in, and stay tuned for our next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thanks,
hosting.
Jessica. That was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Jessica. This is Bruce Mason again.
Hi, yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
Hi. Just to follow up, I'm curious how they do things up in Alaska. With regard to the building code issue, would it help to just from the grassroots, in other words, have some type of advertisement to tell prospective buyers of homes that they should ask if their home has been designed to a building code, something of that nature? Down here in California, we see advertisements on TV. I don't know if you got them up there. It's called Carfax. Carfax. If you buy a used car, they say ask for the Carfax.
Right.
I mean, it sounds corny, but you can see what they're doing. They're starting at the grassroots level. So the buyer will actually put some incentive on the seller to actually do more than the minimum. Just a thought.
No, that's a great idea. Yeah, there have been a number of ideas floated to try to overcome this issue with people not wanting to be told how to build their things. This is partially why that building codes weren't one of the issues that we're taking on at first, just because it is a huge can of worms, and kind of just want to keep talking to people and get more ideas about how we can overcome this issue. But that is a great idea, have kind of a home facts for people, because it is important. A lot of people try to sell houses here that are not in a state that should be sold, at least just from what I'm aware of.
Exactly. The point is, I could see some person living out in the wilderness, wants to build how they want to build because they're going to live there. But there's a lot of homes where buyers are naive consumers, if you will. They're not earthquake experts.
Oh
And so
yeah,
for them,
yeah, especially people that move up here from the lower 48, they have no idea about it. So
yeah. Okay.
yeah.
So, okay, just a thought. Thank you for the presentation. I'm going to sign off now. Bye now.
Thanks for tuning in. Talk to you later.
Bye.